Hello, good morning if you're in Hong Kong, and welcome to the latest FCC Zoom event breakfast talk. Before we begin, just a note about an upcoming event on Thursday. We're going to have Sunny Shui, who's the publisher of Frontier Myanmar, talking at 8 p.m, so make sure you don't miss that. But for now, I don't need to tell everyone, for more than a year, COVID-19 has completely disrupted our lives, our travel, our work, our social routines. Just yesterday, for example, even as some countries like the UK loosened restrictions, other countries like Bangladesh went into complete lockdown again, basically. But the good news is more and more vaccines are being administered, including here in Hong Kong, which means we can tentatively start trying to imagine what a post-COVID future might look like. And luckily for us, our very distinguished guest today, Fareed Zakaria, has already done the work for us on that. His new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, he outlines the social, technological, and economic consequences we might be seeing a few years down the line after the pandemic. When he's not writing best-selling books, Fareed Zakaria hosts Fareed Zakaria GPS for CNN Worldwide. He's also a columnist for The Washington Post and a contributing editor for The Atlantic. His other books are all bestsellers too: In Defense of a Liberal Education, The Post-American World, and The Future of Freedom, which is a study of illiberal democracy in various countries. Lots to talk about. So without further ado, I will hand you over to our moderator, FCC President Keith Richburg.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Fareed. Good morning from here in Hong Kong. Good evening for you in New York. How are you today?
I'm very well. I think the old hand journalists will appreciate this. I'm doing this with a glass of wine, which I imagine that there was a time at the Foreign Correspondents Club, even at 8 in the morning, that would not seem inappropriate.
Absolutely so. I would expected nothing less. So good to see you again, Fareed. Thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it. We know how busy you are. The book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, it's so timely. But before we talk about the book, you wrote about COVID-19 and we talk about it all the time with all of these deaths going on, and the numbers are so great that sometimes they lose meaning. But I want to say, our condolences from everybody here at the Foreign Correspondents Club on the loss of your mother, who died of complications from COVID. So really sorry to hear that. We were actually really surprised you would still want to do this event with us under the circumstances. But could you just take a moment and just tell our, all the listeners into this, just tell us something about your mom that you would like everybody to know.
Sure. I mean, the first thing I would say is she was a consummate professional, and so she would be very upset if I would have canceled the engagement, particularly with journalists on her account. I think that the striking thing when I look back is how much for granted I took the fact that I had a working mother in India in the 1960s and 70s, and how rare that was, and how you really had to be the superwoman who managed it all, because it wasn't just that you had to take care of the kids and, take care of the house. And obviously in India, as in Hong Kong, there, you have help, but more importantly, psychologically, you had to see yourself in that role as primarily in that role. My father was in government. And so when he would entertain, often you should be doing these big dinners, and people would often, particularly if they were foreigners, nobody would have any clue that she had this whole other career that she was, kind of keeping in the back of her. And she started in journalism very much the way women would have started. She started as the person who was given the children's page, because she had been a social worker who worked with kids. So they said, why don't you take the children's page, which had been run by a woman named Auntie Wendy, an English woman. So she became Auntie Wendy. And she would write this page, and she did it so well that they asked her, well, why don't you come over to the real magazine? And gave her the title, the exalted title, which again, old Hong Kongers will know from British journalism, of sub-editor. The first post on the ladder, the first rung on the ladder in those days was sub-editor, which I think mercifully doesn't exist anymore as a title, because it sort of vaguely sounds like you're subhuman or something like that. And then she just worked her way up from there, and did it with this, ease and effortlessness that I now look back on, and I think, God, even when I was going through my my career, I was very lucky that I was married and I had a wife who was very supportive at the time and looked after the kid. And she was doing it 25 years early. It really is that line about Ginger Rogers, that she was doing everything Fred Astaire was doing backwards and in high heels. I sort of felt that way when I looked back on her. But mostly, one more thought, mostly you just realize the point you began with, these are not statistics, they're human beings. But another way to think about that is we talk a lot and we will talk a lot, because this is what I talk about in my book, about all the external things we need to do to handle something like COVID. Government programs, public health programs, corporate, this, that, and the other. There's really also a very interesting question of what kind of internal supports do you need to get through something like this? What are the kind of psychological, traits that you need to cultivate? How best to go through something like this? And we spend less time talking about that, I think, particularly, but it's actually as important because it's this huge event that washes all over us, and we're still trying to figure out what we think about.
Yeah, and one of the tragedies in your personal case and for so many more millions is because of the travel restrictions and quarantines, you couldn't fly to India, and others couldn't be with their loved ones, and people are dying and being buried without the normal funerals we might have. I mean, that must leave some kind of lasting kind of sadness.
It's the principal sadness, I feel, actually, because she was frail and she had been declining. So in a sense, it wasn't, at some level, it's always unexpected, but it wasn't so unexpected. She was diabetic, she was overweight, she had a heart condition. When you get COVID in that situation, it's not going to be an easy story. And even before that, she had been declining. But that sense of not being able to, even with somebody like that, not being able to see them for the last time, not being able to, I've always thought of closure as one of these slightly gimmicky words, but I now really feel it, that sense of not being able to have a sense of, having, luckily I did get a chance very often to tell her that I loved her and to thank her, but you still feel like you wanted that chance to be able to say it properly or to say it in a way that she would understand. My daughter got into Wellesley a week or two before she died. And the last time I talked to her, she wasn't really able to understand, so I don't think she got it. And then not to be able to bury her, so that feeling of distance and sadness and unresolved the unresolved emotion, I think would have been better. If you'd gone and seen the body, even if I hadn't been able to see her before, gather with family, reminisce in that circle, there's a reason I think cultures have always mourned together around the body. There's something very healing about that, I think. And that I was not able to do. And, it's the sore that I still have from it.
Sure. Well, our condolences, and with your mom. She sounds like a remarkable person. But, to ask you some, tell me about New York. I mean, when I was living in New York with the Washington Post, my office was at Columbus Circle, 58th Street and 9th Avenue, right near Time Warner. I can't imagine a New York that's not bustling and crowded with people and traffic, but is that coming back now? Or what's it like when you if you go out to have your lunch around Columbus Circle? Is it getting back to normal?
Oh God, New York is back to normal with a vengeance. Now there are exceptions. So, but let me first give you a sense of what it feels like to go exactly as you were asking. So my three kids, my ex-wife and I went out for dinner last night to reminisce about my mother. And we went to the local bistro that is right close to us. And I say bistro because it's a French restaurant. It was bustling. I mean, there wasn't like there wasn't a table to be had. It doesn't feel quite as crowded because they are at 25% capacity, but I think restaurants use 25% in a very creative way. I think that I would love to see what 100% looks like if this is 25%, but it was bustling. There are people at the bar, people, which again, by the way, is technically illegal. If you go downtown to the Village or to Soho, the restaurants are packed. Again, under these constraints of limitations. We went to the Frick Museum yesterday, which is now in what's called the Met Breuer. Lots of people there. But I'd say two or three things. If you go to Midtown, it's a ghost town. So that you are already beginning to see the shape of the new New York, which is these large stretches of office space. There is no one there. If you look at the subways, they are much less crowded, but as a result, there are many fewer trains. And capacity, I think ridership is still about 50%. There are sort of places, obviously if you go to Broadway and walk around, it's like a ghost town. So there are places where you see things have gone, but markets adjust so that a third of New York's restaurants have closed. So if you go to a restaurant in New York today, you don't find them feeling very desolate, because first of all, there's one of the few things that are open. Two, there's the same number of people with 1/3 of the restaurants gone. So it's an odd feeling. Now, I've talked to friends of mine in Paris and in Frankfurt and places like that. New York is more open and more bustling than almost any of those places. Part of it is we followed the social distancing very well. And I think that part of the lesson here is if you take this stuff seriously and you follow it, you get out of it faster. So, you'll still see, by the way, in every situation I described in New York, including in public, in the park, mask wearing is somewhere between 95 and 99%. New York now feels like Tokyo, by which I mean people just wear masks without thinking about it. If you're not wearing it, somebody will point it out. If you walk into a shop without it or a restaurant, they'll just give you one. You cannot operate in New York without a mask. So because of that, maybe you've had a greater ability to actually do things.
Yeah, and I asked you about New York because you wrote in the book, you love cities, I love cities. And I'm trying to figure out, and you talk about it in the book, how are cities going to change going forward because of it? Or will they change at all? Will they just go back to the way they were? Or we've heard talk about maybe there'll be more space so people can socially distance. Maybe the tyranny of the car will be ended and there'll be more bike lanes and pedestrian lanes. Or do you think we're just going to go back to the way we are once the vaccines, give us herd immunity?
No, I think there's going to be a big difference. Look, there's no question people are going to still live in and around big cities and in and around cities. I shouldn't say big cities. Why do I say that? For a simple reason. The single dominant trend of human demographics for the last 400 years has been people moving from villages and rural areas to cities. The story of industrialization can be told very simply as peasants leaving the farms and moving to the cities. And the reason we have done that is you make more money in the cities. You make more money in urban environments because there are more people, more deals, more investments, more accidental encounters, more planned encounters, all those reasons. So that driving motor, which by the way, particularly in Asia, is accelerating, is not likely to stop as a result of this. The information economy actually makes it more likely, not less. Now, there is one big shift that has taken place, which is that people have realized that you can do much more remote work, particularly in the knowledge economy. And in largely, first world countries are turning into service economies. So that means a large part of what people can do, not everybody, but a lot of people can do, can be done digital. So I think that's what makes it different from the 20s after the Spanish influenza. People have this alternative. So I think you're going to see cities reconfigured for that reason. But I think what it means is that more people will choose to live in the suburbs of metro areas. People might choose to live in Queens rather than in Manhattan, in Brooklyn rather than in Manhattan, in parts of Manhattan where they get a little more space than Harlem rather than Midtown. And I think that is certainly going to be a very large part of this. Some of it will be that people will choose to live in smaller cities rather than in a big one and choose to come in to it. I think you're going to see a much more WeWork. I say this in the book. WeWork, the company failed, but the WeWork model of work, I think, has succeeded. and it will triumph, which is that you will view offices as places where you meet, gather, plan, congregate, but you don't have to do solo work there. And if you do, you'll get a cubicle where you will plug in. Other than C-suite executives, the idea of an office, a dedicated office that you have 24/7 with your family photographs in there and your tchotchkes and memorabilia, that I think is a relic of the past, except for the very senior people. So I think it all will look different. Now, you pointed out something about the cars. That itself is going to be very interesting to see, because right now what's happened is public transport has collapsed as everybody is taking cars because they are worried about getting the virus. Will that translate into something different? Will it mean that, as you say, more bicycles and things? You have to ride an awful lot of bicycles to get up to the subway ridership of New York City, which, as you know, is several million a day. It's one of the largest in the world. So I think that part will remain to be seen. And finally, all this depends on good management. New York is actually particularly badly managed at this time. We've got a bad mayor and a not so great governor. Some places will do much better because they will be well managed. Singapore will get through this fine. Singapore is probably the best run city in the world, and they will find a way to adapt to this in ways that are, actually advantageous. So I think that you can't get around that. Whatever the trend is, if you are maladjusted, if you take on too much debt, if you manage things badly, you're going to do badly. But that doesn't mean, even if New York does poorly, and I actually don't think, I think it's quite possible that it actually does fine. But even if New York does poorly, it doesn't mean cities are doing badly.
Sure. And I'm glad you mentioned Singapore, because I did want to ask the question, from where we are, we look around and we say the virus has not had the big impact in East Asia as it had in the US, the UK, Europe. Partly you could put that down to the culture of mask wearing. Everybody put their masks on here very, very quickly. But again, what are your thoughts on that when you look around the world? And again, I know it's a hodgepodge. I know some places did better in Europe than other places, et cetera. But is there some consistent theme we see in the places that have done really well and the places that have done particularly poorly?
Well, you put it really correctly. It's a bit of a hodgepodge, and anyone who draws grand conclusions about it should be wary. And just as the moment when you thought the third world was going to be devastated by this, you had this bizarre situation where third world countries were just not getting very many COVID deaths. And just, I remember I had on Sid Mukherjee, one wonderful Pulitzer Prize winning doctor, writer for the New Yorker. And he came on my show and said, it's extraordinary. The third world just is not getting these deaths are just much, much lower than we thought. Literally the next week, India had this massive COVID spike. But by the way, Pakistan has not. Pakistan and Bangladesh are doing fine. So, the one consistent theme you can find is it traveled fastest and most furiously in the rich world because it is the most connected, globalized part of the world, and you have reasonable population density. But within that, the rich world, the countries that acted aggressively, early, and intelligently managed to stave it off considerably. And I think that's East Asia, basically. Most of the credit for that goes to, just smart, good government action. There's a second part, which I'll get to, but I want to give you the one example, which to me is really the telling one. So Taiwan is very close to China. Taiwan has had all these experiences with various flus. When Taiwan gets news of it, first of all, it distrusts information coming out of China. It does its own research and its own homework. It comes to the conclusion that better be safe than sorry. They had a bad experience with SARS, so they act early. They act aggressively by requiring masks even before it was clear it was a respiratory disease, by closing down travel before it was clear that how serious this was. And most importantly, they act intelligently, which is to say, they put in place a 24-hour mandatory quarantine for anyone who has COVID or who has been in contact with someone who has COVID. Now, the reason this is so important is because the thing people didn't seem to realize is in the early stages of this crisis, very few people have COVID. So if you can get those small number of people immediately out of circulation, the rest of the population can go about its life normally. So Taiwan had in total 1% of its population infected or thought to be infected. They took those people and forced them to do 14-day quarantines. And it's a democracy, but it was mandated. And it was a real quarantine. They gave you a cell phone. They would ring you 3 times a day. If you didn't pick up the phone, if you had gone sneaked out to get a drink, that, if you didn't pick up the phone, it was a prima facie violation of the quarantine. By doing that, what's remarkable is that Taiwan was able to get through this crisis with 10 COVID deaths, with a population of 22 million, and much more importantly, with not a single day's lockdown. You see, by constantly taking the infected and potentially infected out of the mainstream is able to continue to function normally. Just to give you a comparison, Taiwan is 22 million people. New York State is 20 million people. New York State is at 40,000 deaths. Taiwan is at 10.
Yeah, it's incredible. In this part of the world, you'll hear a lot of people saying that these numbers you just described show that authoritarian governments can work better. And they'll say, look at China, the place where the virus was first identified, did these very, very strict lockdowns. I mean, nobody could leave their apartments in Wuhan, et cetera. And they'll say, look at the places that are the most kind of so-called exceptional in their democracy, Britain, the United States, and because people wouldn't obey the rules, they wouldn't wear the mask, the virus went off. But when I look around the world, I say, yeah, but Taiwan is a democracy. South Korea is a democracy. So is there anything to be said about the type of government that responds to this sort of virus?
No, and you put it exactly right. Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, by the way, is a complicated situation, but the state did not use any particular police powers or authoritarianism. They just did very similar things that Taiwan and Singapore did, and South Korea did. Very good detective work with contact tracing. New Zealand, Greece, the Netherlands. I'm sorry, not the Netherlands. Denmark, Finland, Iceland. So many democracies have handled this quite well. The trick is, if you didn't handle it well early, it's complicated because then the numbers get very large. So Germany actually handled it quite well, but it did get a large spike initially. And then, as I said, this other factor, which I think is worth talking about, is it's not just the state. There's also an issue with societies. So that the Germans handled this very well. And I was very interested to see what would happen. But then people just got tired of obeying the rules and obeying the social distancing. And in the French case, it was their August vacation, because France also has a good public health system. In the German case, it was Oktoberfest. And they just broke all the rules. Now, if you break all the rules, I mean, the science is science. You're going to get a COVID spike. So at some level, there's something to be said with the idea that, and here you could get into cultural stereotypes, but I actually think it's more complicated. You can say East Asians are more collective, more obedient, all that. But again, if anyone's watched Taiwan's legislature, they're not that, obedient. What it is I think that East Asia went through the experience of SARS and MERS and H1N1 and the scare about Ebola. So that you have had more experiences of these. And so I think in East Asia, this stuff was taken more seriously. I remember I was running Newsweek International when SARS happened, and it just devastated. I mean, Hong Kong was destroyed for a year. I think it was. You were not able to get the economy back. So everybody has that memory in a way that in the West there has not been one. I suspect that the next time around in the West you will see some of the same good behavior that you've seen in East Asia. I'm really not one to believe in cultural generalizations. I think for every obedient Asian, you can find very disobedient and hierarchical and non-hierarchical ones as well.
Sure, and you write about the governments, and you write about it's the quality of government, not necessarily the quantity of it. So some governments, like New Zealand, did everything kind of right, and they were rewarded by being reelected. So I mean, government really, people's views of government may have changed now because of this pandemic and how government handled the pandemic. Would you agree with that? Or?
Absolutely. And as you say, it's the quality, not the quantity. Taiwan has a tiny government by Western standards. I mean, Taiwan's healthcare bureaucracy is astonishing. I think they spend 5 to 6% of GDP on their healthcare. We spend in America 17 to 18%. They have better outcomes, by the way, in general, and they did much better on the pandemic. So clearly a case where it's not the amount of money you spend, but to the point you were making. New Zealand is a good example. Greece is another fascinating example. Greece has a terrible bureaucracy, dysfunctional. We all know the various horror stories about Greece. It has a very smart technocratic prime minister who comes out of the private sector, American educated, I think Harvard Business School. And he just took this whole thing very seriously and, acted early, acted aggressively, listened to the scientists, protected the downside, made worst case planning. Greece has done remarkably well. So, it's why, by the way, Boris Johnson switched halfway through, and he's benefiting now from the fact that he learned from his initial mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, though, the ones that did the worst, the United States, the UK, they're actually doing better now with the vaccine rollout. So we're starting to see the opposite going on. Here in Hong Kong, I think the vaccine take-up rate as of today is less than 8%, even though they've got enough for the entire population. So there seems to be a matter of the opposite here. Those that did very well don't seem to see the need to rush out and get vaccinated. And there's also in Hong Kong this distrust of government, whereas in the places that did poorly, they're doing pretty well in terms of getting the jabs into arms.
Yeah, exactly. So I actually predicted this in the book where I said the United States, which handled phase 1 of the problem badly, will handle phase 2 well, because phase 1 of the problem requires that American government, federal, state, and local, work very well in a coordinated fashion. The bureaucracies have to get their act together. That's hard for America under any circumstance, and under Trump, it was essentially impossible, because you had a guy as president who really viewed the presidency more like a reality television show. It was the point of being president was not to actually manage the federal bureaucracy, but to tweet. So it was a kind of performative presidency. But the second phase of the crisis largely involves two things: federal money and private sector expertise, which is the vaccine. And so the feds funded all the vaccine and the private sector developed it. And there, America is still miraculous. I mean, America is unbeatable. And Britain is a very strong contender in that field as well. So I think what you saw is the highly individualistic countries where the private sector tends to outperform, where the government has enough money to throw money at the problem. Those ended up doing very well. Hong Kong, as you correctly described, is a very peculiar, unique case. I mean, Hong Kong, I think in general, basically fits the Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan model in that very good, very competent institutions. But there is this complicated overlay of China-Hong Kong relations and Hong Kong people's distrust of Carrie Lam's government because of, so I think Hong Kong right now would not fit very easily in the categories because it's almost become sui generis. But I think in general, you'd have to put it more into the East Asian countries. Look, in the initial phases, it handled it as well as Singapore.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fascinating to watch what's happening now with the vaccine and the rollout. One interesting point that you brought up is this idea of distrust. This distrust of the media, distrust of institutions in general, as we saw during the Trump presidency, distrust of elites. Do you think that's going to change now? Now that you don't have a megaphone of Trump on Twitter trashing Dr. Fauci, or is there still that kind of distrust of elites?
No, I think it's going to get worse over time. Trump was a manifestation of it. Trump recognized it and took advantage of it. But I think it fundamentally comes out of this reality that we are now in a world in which there is an enormous divide between people who are urban educated folk and people who are rural, less educated folk. And that divide has become a kind of class divide, a cultural divide, a geographic divide. So if you want to look at the 2020 election as an indication, the single strongest predictor of whether you voted for Trump or Biden was party identity, party loyalty. Were you a member of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? So party loyalty is still the number one predictor. The second strongest predictor was whether you had some college education, not necessarily a four-year degree, but some. That was the second strongest predictor. Now, just to go, if you went back 20 or 30 years, this was not a very good predictor of how you vote. The third strongest predictor was whether you lived in a metro area or in a rural area. So you see that what is happening is that these identities that are more wrapped up with education, with geography, are becoming political identifications and almost cultural identifications, by which I mean unchanging. They become a kind of definition of who you are. And now add to this one more fact, which is, so 81 million people voted for Biden, 74 million for Trump. In the grand scheme of things, very similar numbers, right? Biden's electorate generated 70% of the GDP of the United States. Trump's electorate generated 30%. So what you have is the rural, less educated folk who largely voted for Trump, deeply resentful of the power, the privilege, the cultural power, the money, the earning power of all these people. And I think it plays out in the pandemic in exactly that way, where it's the digital elite who are able to continue and maintain their income, and it's the non-digital people who are working with their hands who are not able to. And this divide, by the way, is not just happening in America. It's happening in India, where Modi benefits enormously by appealing to a kind of rural resentment of urban elites. It's happening in Turkey, where Erdogan takes advantage of exactly that phenomenon. It's happening in France, where the strongest opposition to Emmanuel Macron is from the Gilets jaunes, which is essentially a rural, less educated movement. The Brexit vote breaks down on exactly these lines. The single strongest predictor of Brexit after party was college education as well. So I think we're in a world of this kind of new class warfare. And I think we are going to have to recognize that one of the great downsides, the challenges that we, let's face it, everyone on this call is going to face is a great deal of distrust and resentment of us, of the messages we bring, which is why, one has to be very careful, in how you phrase your message, even how you live your life. Look, I'll be honest. I'm sure there were ways, I never looked into it, but I'm sure there were ways I could have gotten a vaccine out of line. I scrupulously did everything by the book, waited until it was possible for somebody with my age category to do it. I used a pharmacy, just one of the many, the CVS, Walgreens type places, and just filled out the form and went there. Put myself at the mercy of the guy doing the pharmacist doing it, because the last thing you want, is to have that feeling that people have that we are privileged and we are taking advantage of that privilege to game the system, to get into colleges. All that stuff is wrapped up with this resentment that is real and I think is growing.
Yeah, well, you mentioned in the book the 2008 financial crisis was one of the big crises of the 21st century. 9/11, 2008 financial crisis, and now the pandemic. 2008 also exposed that inequality around the world, not just in the United States. And again, we're still talking about inequality, all of these years later. Do you think something is going to be done now because of this, new vision of it we have because of the pandemic? Or are we going to, again, go back to our old ways where if you're college educated and elite and live in cities, you'll be one way and everyone else is going to feel left out? What can the pandemic change?
Yeah, I think things are changing, and I think that they're changing as they should change. Partly we've become aware of it more. I think, look at the way we talk about essential workers. And I think it's happening all over the world. People are realizing, the people who work at hospitals, the people who work in public transport, that our lives couldn't go on without that. Many of us were able to continue to work digitally, but the reason we were able to work digitally was because a bunch of people, picking up the garbage and turning on the water and turning on the electricity and, picking the crops so that we could continue to do what we were doing. But I think more broadly, look, this Biden plan, Biden economics, if you will, is massive. I mean, this is a turning point after 40 years of Reaganism, Thatcherism, and austerity. It is saying that the government can be a primary motor of economic growth and justice. It can be a place where you derive, a huge amount of the firepower for an economy. That firepower can be directed toward the bottom of society, not the top. I mean, think about it in these terms. All the time I've lived in America, every major fiscal policy that the United States undertook was to cut taxes largely for the rich. The Reagan tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, all had that effect. Or we spend money on wars. This is the first fiscal policy since 1980 in which the benefits will largely accrue to the middle, lower middle, and lower classes. Child poverty will be cut in half in 1 year in the United States. So I think this is a big deal. I mean, I hope it continues in the sense that the infrastructure bill is the next big hurdle. But the most unlikely man, Joe Biden, the oldest poll around, has turned out to be a more transformational figure than Barack Obama, the seemingly transformational figure. Now, part of that, to be clear, is Obama was not allowed to be a transformational figure. He had to content himself with the symbolism of being the first African-American president, which he handled magnificently. But it is true, nonetheless, that Joe Biden will end up being the transformational figure in terms of substance and policy.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And before I get to some questions from our audience listening, and we had quite a few, but I did want to ask you one more thing that you mentioned a lot in the book, globalization. It seems to have taken a bit of a hit because, we had all of these open borders. I grew up on the border of Canada in Detroit, Michigan. I never had a passport to go back and forth. I didn't even know it was a border. People in Europe had constructed this kind of border-free travel. All of a sudden, with the pandemic, we saw borders closing. And now we see kind of vaccine nationalism. We see, people not wanting to share the vaccines and sometimes having enough to vaccinate their own populations 3 times over. Do you think we're going to go back to open borders, supply chains around the world, or do you think people are going to use the pandemic as an excuse to kind of put globalization on the back foot again?
Well, certainly if you listen to people and you listen to the rhetoric of politicians, you'd get the feeling that globalization is, we're in a deglobalization phase. And that your supply chains are going to come home, globalization is going to unravel. My perspective is that some of that will happen for sure, but watch what people do rather than what they say. Watch what countries do rather than what they say. So in this same last year that we've had this pandemic and all the talk you mentioned correctly, the 15 largest countries in Asia, except for India, all got together and signed a free trade agreement, which is the largest free trade pact in the world right now. The countries of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, minus America, all forged essentially the Trans-Pacific Partnership minus America. Africa's countries all got together, most got together and formed a free trade pact. Modest and more in theory than in practice, but better than we had before. Europe has signaled its desire and is getting close to signing a free trade pact or trade and investment pact with China. Why is all this happening? It's happening for a very simple reason. People need growth. Countries need growth, particularly in a pandemic that slows the economy down. The last thing you're going to do is try to put in place taxes that hinder growth. And by the way, that is what tariffs are. They're simply taxes. And so I suspect that you will see a bit of a yin and yang. There will be some pullbacks. There will be areas where, particularly where it can be publicly demonstrated that you're doing something, people will pull back. But for the most part, I think what you're likely to see is a slow expansion of globalization, a little bit more careful, more remedies for losers, which, by the way, is a good idea. But even the United States, we're 4% of the world's population. If we want to raise the standards of living of our people, we're going to have to trade with the other 96%. We're going to have to get investments from them. So you have to stay reasonably open.
Sure. And one more question for me, which is really, I have so many for me, but I do want to get to audience questions here. But democratization, in addition to globalization, democratization seems to have been put on the back foot. We've seen authoritarian governments around the world using the pandemic and using pandemic restrictions to accumulate more power, to ban protests, to arrest people if they gather more than 4 people on the streets. I'm thinking of Thailand, for example, the Philippines, other places. I mean, do you think democratization has been put on the back foot by the pandemic?
Yes, but it's an acceleration of an existing trend. As much of what's happened this year, these are trends that were taking place. The pandemic somehow hypercharged them. Think about the digital economy. Think about some of these rivalries between the US and China, for example. I think that what has happened is the autocrats have gotten very clever over the last 15 years, and they have figured out how to use democracy to subvert democracy. I wrote about this, in The Future of Freedom in 2003. And I coined this term illiberal democracy where you can still, through majority rule, impede and restrict individual rights, liberties, freedom. And the role model I looked at the time was Vladimir Putin, which turned out to be prescient. Because what people forget is Putin came in as a Democrat. I mean, Yeltsin was a popular democratically elected president. He nominated Putin as his successor. Putin won an election. But Putin began to realize that you can manipulate public opinion, institutions. You can do all kinds of things to rig the system. So he fakes a terrorist attack, which gives him enormous sympathy in the polls. He destroys the fundraising sources of the other parties. He sicks the police and tax authorities against every independent media organization. And so all of a sudden you realize, I mean, they do have elections, but somehow the opposition candidates are all in jail or dead or being, investigated for tax fraud. And that model has been used by Duterte, by Erdogan, by Modi, by Orban, so, and it's actually almost like a playbook now. They figured out a way to use the tax authority, use our American, we call it the IRS, use the legal system. You intimidate big businesses into drawing up the funds, and you basically squash political opposition, squash the independent media, squash independent NGOs, and then you hold the elections. And hey presto, you win.
Let me get to a few questions here, and my apologies for people who sent them in if I don't have time, but we got 2 questions here that are related, so I'll ask you both. One comes from John Resnick. And he says, first of all, condolences on the passing of your mother. As she was deeply involved in education, how would you grade America on how it's handled schooling during the pandemic? And a related question is from Al Reyes, a member here, who says, how do you see the pandemic having a lasting impact on education and schooling, like remote teaching and learning and the admissions process? So two related education questions.
Great questions. I don't think the United States handled education particularly well. I think, again, most of the West handled it badly. East Asian countries handled it better. It follows the same pattern. And in this case, we keep saying we should listen to the science. Well, this is a case where we didn't listen to the science enough. But by the way, the scientists didn't listen to the scientists enough, by which I mean the evidence is clear. Children do not get this in a serious way. The numbers, this is a peculiar disease. All of these airborne viruses are, but this one, as we know, I mean, the vast majority of people are over 55. And really, it's over 75s where it really starts to get really lethal and deadly. The numbers of people under 12, under 14 are vanishingly small. So there was a very simple thing you could have done, right? Which is keep the schools open, keep masking and things like that. Make sure that the teachers are vaccinated. But even before you vaccinate the teachers, you could just, with appropriate social distancing, you could have managed the system. Our problem in the United States is we have very strong teachers unions, and that actually got in the way much more than any kind of best practices with regard to science. But let me talk about the larger issue, which the second question raised, because it's really interesting. We all think we've moved to this new digital future, and we're all going to do everything on Zoom. But I think we need to reflect as much on what Zoom and technologies like it did badly as where they succeeded. And my simplest example of that for every parent listening is we all know that Zoom education was a disaster. And there's actually good studies that explain why. Because it turns out that education is as much an emotional and social experience as it is an intellectual one. By which I mean, you want a child to take in knowledge, but the way that a child takes in knowledge depends on, first of all, establishing an element of trust between himself and the person giving it. Trust in the situation socially in which it's happening. Some of the forces that come into play are competition. You're trying to impress the other kids. Some of it is cooperation. You're working with other people. Some of it is just the fun and the joy of being together and the play, if you will, of learning. None of that takes place in digital learning. It's essentially a monologue. And that's suboptimal. That's clearly not the best way to educate kids. Now, if that's the case, what else are we doing in a suboptimal way, right? What else are we letting go of? We've managed to very efficiently do some things and convey some core stuff. But what have we not? What have we left behind? I think that's very important because we are going to enter a hybrid future. We're going to use all these technologies, but we must not just celebrate, okay, my God, it's amazing. Fareed Zakaria is talking to us from New York and we're in Hong Kong. What is it that we're not able to achieve? What are the gaps? What are the holes? And how do we fill them? Some of it will be better digital tools. Some of it, I'm convinced, is, we're human, we're social. We will want to actually gather physically and get that 360 vision of each other that comes from the emotional touching, bonding, the social connection that comes from actually being in the presence of people and in groups and having accidental conversations and serendipitous meetings. So I think that education in a way is a very telling for our hybrid future. We definitely are going to go back to something much closer to, back to normal with education. And we should just reflect on why. Why is it that we found digital education so lacking?
Do you think that's true also of higher education? College students generally can do better doing remote learning than, little kids who may need the social interaction more.
I think you put it exactly right. They do better. My son is a junior at Yale. He did the first semester, and then the second semester he called me up and he said, would you mind if I took the semester off? I said, no, he's a very smart, mature kid. So I said, do whatever you think is right. Why? He said, look, I have only 3 semesters left at Yale. He's a very good student. He takes his courses very seriously. He said, I don't want to waste one more of them where I get up in the morning and I sit in front of my computer and for 6 hours I am looking at a computer screen and just looking at, the professor talking or somebody else talking. He said, it just frazzles your brain. You're tired. You're enervated at the end of it all. And that's not what I signed up for when I signed up to be at one of the greatest universities in the world, right? So I think that, yeah, you can do it, but it's definitely suboptimal.
Sure. Yeah. I've been teaching that way, so I can tell you it's also not good for the teachers also.
Exactly.
We've got a question from Eric Wishart from AFP and our vice president of the Foreign Correspondents Club. He says, your book calls for a bipolar world, but this U.S. Already seemed to reject that. Basically, to summarize, he says, what do you think it would take for the United States to accept that this world is becoming more bipolar?
Time. I think that China's economy continues to grow in a way that does not seem likely to fall off a cliff. Look, I think that the important thing to understand about bipolarity is what it means is it kind of becomes the new definition of the way in which the world is structured, the rules by which it's organized and placed. It doesn't mean that the two poles are equal. as I say in the book, the United States is much richer and much more powerful than China, and will be for a long time. I don't pretend to make grand predictions about the future, but it's highly unlikely, it seems to me, that you will end up with anything near equality. I mean, the United States has, forget the GDP numbers, the United States has 59 treaty allies. China has 1, North Korea. The United States has 800 bases around the world. China has 3. The truth is China is in a geographically very complicated place, where as it rises, it annoys the hell out of its neighbors. But, India, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the United States is unique in the history of international relations and growing as a great power, surrounded by 2 vast oceans and 2 weak neighbors. That reality is not going to replicate itself. So you're never going to have equality, but you will have a world that is more structured by the interaction of these 2 countries, and each one's bouncing off each other than anything else. That will be the single most powerful predictor, if you will. And the best way to look at it, by the way, is to look at the United States' actions. The United States is obsessed with China, right? I mean, for all that it keeps saying, what was all that the United States talks about, when it wants to build infrastructure, we say we got to build it, otherwise China will win. When we want to do higher education, we want to invest in science and technology now, Biden says we got to do it because the Chinese are catching up. When we want to build better trains, what people say are we've got to do it because the Chinese maglev is better than ours. That, to my mind, this is a pretty powerful indicator. I don't hear anybody talking about Japan, the 3rd largest economy in the world, Germany, the 4th largest, right? It's all about China. So in a sense, the US is reflecting that reality. By the way, when the Soviets were around, the United States didn't say, oh yes, it's a bipolar world and the Soviet Union is our equal. No, we never said that. My point is just, this is the way the world is structured. You're going to be thinking about America's relationship to China and China's relationship to America. And everything will be read through that prism. The complication is that it's happening in a highly interdependent world in which everyone is trading with everyone and everyone is investing with everyone. And that's the new layer that we haven't kind of figured out. And how do you maintain that open system while having this rivalry? That's the great challenge for both the United States and China.
Well, during the last Party Congress in Beijing, we heard a lot of talk about America being in decline and China on the rise. And people looked at the pandemic and the response. They looked, for example, at how when China had overcome the pandemic, they're basically down to 0 cases, and the U.S. was still a mess. Earlier this year and late last year, and China's doing vaccine diplomacy. They're giving vaccine away. They're giving their Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines away to Africa and countries in Asia like the Philippines. Do you think that was all just kind of a passing fad that will go back to the way we were, or do you think China will gain something out of this kind of crisis?
Oh, it will absolutely gain something out of it. Look, and it is a reflection of the reality that China is the 2nd richest economy in the world, did handle the pandemic pretty well, has the capacity technologically to provide vaccines for people. But, each side has its own strengths. China's strength are the ones you described, this focused. The United States is this big, sprawling, chaotic, crazy place, but it does happen to have the reserve currency of the world. It has the trust of the world, which means it can borrow essentially ad infinitum, which means that if Biden's plans go through, and I think there's a strong possibility that happens, the United States may grow at something like 6 or 7% by the end of this year, which would mean that the United States, for the first time in 15 years, would provide more to global growth than China. So imagine what this world is going to look like at the end of this year. US is growing 6 or 7% a year, which it hasn't grown, by the way, since 1982. It has hundreds of millions of extra vaccines. Well, I think my back of the envelope calculation is we have at least 350 million extra vaccines that we don't need, that we're going to be donating to the world. The United States is going to be rebuilding infrastructure on a scale that hasn't happened since the Eisenhower age. It's going to be tough to claim that's the declining country. China is going to do fine, but I'm not one of those people who's ever thought. I think the truth about the United States is very complicated, and America always disappoints its greatest detractors and its greatest enthusiasts. We're never quite as great as we claim to be, but we're never quite as bad as the decline school ever tells. Just when you think America has declined, something like Silicon Valley takes off.
That's absolutely true. Let me just ask you a question, because I've been, captivated watching this trial of the police officer in Minneapolis. There's been another one of these shootings. From an international relations standpoint, as when they met in Alaska between the American and the Chinese delegations, the United States criticizes China's human rights record, and they say, look at your race relations, look at what's going on. How much does America have to tackle this problem, or at least try to resolve this problem? And how much is it undercutting America's standing or its ability to speak about human rights around the world?
Well, first, I think the reason we should handle this is because it is a travesty that it continues to happen in America, right? I mean, the truth of the matter is that this is America's great open wound that we have never completely grappled with. I mean, it's difficult for, when I talk to my kids about it, it's difficult to make them understand, for example, that after you fought a civil war to free the slaves, within 20 years, African Americans were back in essentially a position of servitude till the 1960s, right? For almost 100 years. That since then, when they have, things have been opened up, the efforts to desegregate housing, schooling, none of it has really gone as planned. None of it has achieved what it was meant to achieve. And there are all kinds of areas where you see disparities, which seem so clearly related to lingering prejudice and differential treatment. Like that is just, I mean, it's heartbreaking. But it's also, it gets people angry, as it should. So I think the main reason we've got to fix it is because it's immoral, and it's something that we should be ashamed of. To your point, I think, yes, it makes it much harder to come across as the moral arbiters of the world. And this has always been true. When Hubert Humphrey argued for civil rights in 1948, in the 1948 Democratic Convention, he argued at the time that it was going to be very hard for us to claim the mantle of the leadership of the free world if we had these practices. And by the way, it did put pressure on the United States. So I would much rather see us, rather than scaring ourselves silly about, what the Chinese are going to do with 5G, and therefore, getting some big government boondoggle on it. I would much rather see us look at the Chinese issue, and say, okay, if we're going to draw a sharp line between free societies and unfree societies, let's make sure that everybody in America actually has is enjoying the fruits of liberty, liberalism, democracy, liberal democracy. And very clearly, Black Americans are not to the same extent as whites. And very clearly, there remains, a kind of a deep problem that is rooted uniquely in American history. And so it is sort of like our special responsibility to solve.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Before we let you go, Fareed, first, a very short question from Eric Wishart again. He asked, what was it like writing a book during a pandemic? I mean, I guess you can't go do the normal book talks and go around the bookstores and do signings. I mean, what was it? What's it been like?
Well, I wrote the book partly because of that. All of a sudden, I had free time. I mean, I didn't have any all my travel was canceled, every business lunch, every dinner, and so I was holed up. And partly because I was trying to kind of make sense of it. And one of the ways I make sense of stuff is, I read and I write. I read and I talk to people, and then I started to think, wait, I've got something to say here, and it might be helpful for others to help me make sense of this. The book talks were, as you said, everything virtual, everything like this. And unfortunately, one of the tragedies, honestly, of what has happened, again, this is an acceleration of an existing trend, is what sells books is media. I do these because I love doing them, and they're fun, and it's, you like to interact with people. And I particularly always try to do anything involving journalists associations. But the thing that sells books is media. the advice I give people if you want to sell a book, just find as many different ways you can get on TV and radio shows, because a small radio show will have 20, 30, 40,000 people. And those have become much more fit. Now, unfortunately, they've become many fewer places where you can have a serious conversation about books. But it remains true that the reach that media has is simply unparalleled as a way of selling books.
Sure. And last question we ask all of our guests here: what are you reading now, or what can you recommend that our members read besides your own book, of course? What are you reading?
So I just finished Bill Gates's book on climate change, which I really do recommend. It's a very good book. I'm reading a book called The Weirdest People in the World by a Harvard sociologist, which talks about why did Western countries end up being rich, liberal, democratic, individualistic, secular, post-religious. And it's a very interesting kind of sociological argument for why, I'll give you one example. When you ask people, just give us one sentence, who are you? Somebody from the West will say, I am Fareed Zakaria. Somebody from the East, broadly speaking, will say, I am a Muslim. You'll identify your tribe, your religion, you will identify the social context in which if you ask somebody, okay, describe yourself again with just one more word. In the West, people will say, I'm rich, I'm poor, I'm depressed, I'm happy. And again, the East, it would be a second social term. I'm an Uzbek, I'm a Tartar, I'm a Pashtun, so it's a fascinating book along those lines. And one book I'm reading for fun, which is there's this guy, Martin Walker, who is a foreign correspondent. You might even have bumped into him, Keith. For many years, I think for The Guardian and places like that. At some point, he started to spend his summers in France and started to write detective novels. And he's written a series of, detective novels that have sold very well. So the last time I was in the bookstore, I thought to myself, I got to get one of these books to understand, like, are they really good? How did he do it? And so I'm reading the first one. It's Bruno something's the name of the detective. And they're damn good. And it makes me think, my goodness, that would be a cool third act.
Okay, we can't wait for the Fareed Zakaria novel that's coming out next.
Yeah.
Fareed Zakaria.
Unfortunately, I don't have the talent. Other than that, it would work.
Oh, you're a great writer from this book. Host of GPS, the Global Public Square on CNN, Washington Post columnist, active member on the Council of Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for joining us. We all appreciate that. Thanks to our team here at the FCC for putting this together, and for our host, Rebecca Bailey, who joined me here earlier. Again, thank you, Fareed. We really appreciate it. And again, our hearts, our condolences go out to you on the loss of your mother. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Real pleasure.